Thank you for joining us this afternoon at the latest instalment of Texts in the City. My name is Jenny Niven. I'm the Programme Manager at Melbourne Writers Festival. And joining me this afternoon is Peter Rose. We will be discussing David Malouf's Ransom. So Peter Rose he's a poet and novelist. Some of you may know him from Rose Boys, his family memoir, which came out a couple of years ago. But he's also the editor of the Australian Book Review, and he's written quite extensively on David Malouf's Ransom, as well as quite a few of his other texts. So he's going to have lots of interesting insights for us. We'll discuss the book for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to you folks for questions. So if there's things that you really want to know about the book while you've been studying it that have really cropped up that you're interested in, save those to the last 10 minutes or so, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we possibly can. Please join me first, though, in welcoming Peter Rose. Right, well, to start with, actually, first, can you just put your hand up if you've already read Ransom? How many in the audience know it? Maybe we'll ask them the question. Okay, well, as you know then, Ransom draws on Homer's Iliad. It's set in Greece. Our lead characters are Priam and Achilles, and I'm not going to spend too long, I don't think, giving too much of a preamble if you're all already familiar with the text. So let's just jump right into the beginning. And I might ask you, Peter, to start with that David Malouf grew up as a child in Brisbane, where he says in the afterword in the book he was accustomed to watching the soldiers all leave Australia for war in the Second World War. So he takes that as his setting. He's growing up surrounded by that on a very practical level, but then in a more academic sense, he's absolutely absorbed by the classics. He's a voracious reader when he's a kid. So what happens? Where does the story come from, and how does David Malouf draw these things together? Why do we get a book like Ransom from David Malouf at this time in his career?
Thanks, Jenny, and good afternoon, everyone. I think one of the really remarkable things about any major artist's career, and Malouf is in really a class of his own, be the commanding man of letters in this country, is the uses that they make of materials. And particularly for students, I think it's very important to study that afterward very closely. Writers, they're very loaded. They may be short, but they're very loaded documents. And it's a very important account of how the Troy story had the power, the impact it did on the 9-year-old Malouf. Now, the 9-year-old Malouf was effectively probably like your average 17-year-old. He'd read a hell of a lot. He wasn't named after David Copperfield for nothing. And he then went on, he was entranced by the story, the incomplete story. He went on, as he tells us, to write a poem about it 30 years later. David Malouf began as a poet. He wrote many books of poems before he published a novel in his 40s. And then almost 40 years later, and 10 years after his last novel, comes this late, somewhat valedictory feeling, a novel of farewell. And I think that's a measure of how the story, particularly, it's very important, between Achilles and Patroclus, I hope my Greek pronunciation of that name is correct. I think we say Patroclus. That's very, very important for him, as is the whole idea of power and the use of power. He was very close to it in Brisbane, which was, overrun by American soldiers. But I think that power of the love between Achilles and Patroclus, his great friend, but clearly also lovers, exerted a tremendous power on Malouf that chimes with, as you get to know Malouf's work, with earlier novels, which are often about the intense emotions and differences and love, sometimes not expressed, not fulfilled, between two young men. His first novel, you'll be familiar with, Jono, that introduced him to us in the early 70s, is about the great friendship between Jono and his schoolboy friend Dante.
Right. Can we talk a little bit about the differences between Homer's Iliad and David Malouf's Ransom? Do you want to give us a bit of an overview of that relationship?
Well, and I'm glad Jenny's mentioned it. For those of you not familiar with it or who haven't reread it for a while, as I hadn't when I reviewed Ransom for the magazine, it's what they call an original text, one of the great texts of the Western canon, the Western experience. And in the new Fagles translation, very affordable, Penguin available at your nearest bookshop, you get I was shocked by how I'd forgotten the drama, the intensity of the violence, the sheer gore in the Homer, beautifully translated in this work. Malouf, of course, is writing a novella of only about, 50,000 words, shall we say. The Iliad is how many? 16,000 lines, rhyming lines in the original, and just half of his output, Homer's output. Malouf is a bit of a miniaturist. He's not an epic man. Maybe when he tries the epic, as in a novel called The Great World in 1990, which won his only Miles Franklin Award, may be less successful than the more miniature works like this. And the book that this most resembles his 1980 novella, An Imaginary Life, which you could read as a pair, these two. It's almost like revisiting An Imaginary Life. So, for instance, in the great scene, David's not particularly interested, I think, in plot. He's not a high-plotting novelist. He's not very interested in high drama. Homer is only about high drama. He's not so that is I think a stark difference between the two. So that the extraordinary scene when Hector's is dispatched and his body defiled is in the Homer, is at book 16, really one of the most astonishing long accounts of violence and also the depravity of war, if you like. In Malouf, over in a while. That's not what I think is most interesting David Malouf.
So the idea of the epic, then, the Iliad is a great and a classic text and an epic novel, prose novel, and we talk a lot about these kind of big bombastic sounding words. Given that David Malouf draws so strongly on that story for Ransom, can you talk about why you would you apply the word epic to David Malouf's story, and if not, why not?
I don't think we can call someone who is so primarily motivated by human psychology. He's working in such a tradition, a 20th century tradition, where in a sense the outward world and the outward drama falls away and the dramas are interior. And for that, I don't think he's an epic writer. He's not a grand writer on that scale. He doesn't attempt it. I don't think it actually interests him. What David Malouf has done time and time again is taken often very ordinary individuals, though there's nothing ordinary about Priam, the king of Troy, but take men at a certain a vulnerable point in their lives. Priam has lost yet another son. He's had 50 of them, but now he's down to about his last 10. And he's conscious of his mortality, talks rather movingly about losing his strength, losing a muscle tone, losing his kingship, more conscious of the loneliness of kinghood, and then has a son not just killed in front of him, he's watching on the walls of Troy, but then defiled, dragged around in front of him every day. And so what Malouf is interested in seeing how this man will react. And as with so many of Malouf's characters, that entails a lapsing out almost, a floating away from your past, a floating maybe almost toward yourself. Often used in images described in intimacies of great fluidity, Often water is mentioned. Often they will step through a creek. I think there is another creek in this novel, in the long scene with Somax. A stepping out, and that often will culminate in what we rather grandly call, to use another great Greek word, the epiphany, the moment of tremendous, somewhat belated self-realisation, self-knowledge. And here, of course, Priam, who's been a king, a warrior, a father, an endless father, suddenly is, when he says to Somax, he's suddenly being very democratic, he's swapping griddle cakes, whatever they are, with Somax sharing wine, which a Trojan king did not do. And he says rather movingly to one of his sons before he goes, the sons, the family, of course, hate the thought of Priam leaving them. They think it's sort of too deferential for him to do this. But Priam says, well, maybe it's time for me to find out what it's like to be human. And I think that's the quintessential Malouf trick, to put people, to uproot them, upheave their lives, and see if they have the capacity to become rounder humans. And whereas, so that the demands of kingship, the grandeur of war, the complexities of war, they're just, in a sense, the backdrop, I think, to the interior. It's an inward novel, a novel of inwardness. It's a novel of inward looking, inward searching.
Yeah. I'll go on to ask you a little bit about the characters in a second, but in the meantime, if we've established then that the aim of Ransom is not necessarily to write an epic novel, and yet that's what the Iliad is, what does that tell us about the nature of storytelling then, if you can take the same premise for a story and have two completely different outcomes? What does that tell us about storytelling? And would you like to say something about David Malouf's opinion on storytelling and how the idea of stories features in Ransom?
David's a wonderful, if those of you who have had an opportunity to hear David talk about his writing, he is the master communicator, I think, in Australia about writing. And if there are, for the students in the room, there must be a lot of stuff online that you could read about his technique, but also there would be film stuff, I would have thought. And if you have an opportunity to hear him, he will explain his method in modest and compelling ways, to a degree that I think very few writers who aren't always great communicators can do. He often talks just about, he doesn't force a book, he waits for it to happen to him. He uses that kind of language, which is the language of, say, of a romantic poet, that you wait for the work to force it to work on you, not the reverse. And that he will often, I think he said somewhere, it's a great line too, that unless a book has worked on him for 20 years, it's not worth writing. And I think that this is a measure that he waits for this, the kind of that brewing, stewing, percolating kind of process. And that's a very authentic way of producing art, rather than being forced because someone's offering you $50,000 to write your next book, or you've got a book contract.
Do you think that's an excuse the students can use if they're late for an essay and waiting for it to work on me?
Maybe not 20 years. I don't know how you go there. That's a very a highly artistic, I think, way of waiting for it. And I think it also explains why something like Ransom, you put Ransom next to the Iliad, and you've got a very, very weird mix. It's a bit like, Elizabeth Barrett Browning doing Medea. It's really wild. But why not? I think he illustrates that writers, since whenever, Shakespeare fed off Ovid, who's the character in An Imaginary Life, going into exile. All writers look back to the original works and then, in a sense, try to, not subvert them, but overcome them, put their own stamp on them, twist them, add their own meanings to it. And this is a very interesting way of doing that. For some of us, and I'm in that camp, the effort the gulf between the two, from my point of view, was too wide. I admire the book's qualities, and we must leave a moment or two to talk about the sheer beauty of the prose. He writes some of the most beautiful prose anywhere in English, not just in Australia. This man knows his way around a sentence and a paragraph in ways that very few writers still do. And I've forgotten my thread then.
We were talking about storytelling, but I think you've raised a really important point for the students, one that we've touched on a little bit in some of the texts in the City previous discussions, is that there's more than one opinion of a book, right? Yeah. And you can read all kinds of things into the text, and you'll be taught them in quite a structured way in the VCE lessons, but hopefully one of the ideas of this series is that to open up the idea that there's very many different approaches to, and the same with criticism and reviews. Lots of people will take different opinions to different texts.
And the book was immensely well received here and overseas. I'm just going to take the liberty of reading the last paragraph from my review, which I brought some copies along too if students want to have a look at it, the review that appeared in ABR, but it is online. Malouf states in the afterword that his primary interest in this book is in storytelling. Quote, why stories are told and why we need to hear them, how stories get changed in the telling, unquote. But this is storytelling in Ransom of a swooniness that is very different from Homer's. At times, the gulf between Priam's pilgrimage and Homer's bloodbath induces a kind of impatience in the reader for the stark, the sinewy, the possessed, the inflamed. Trademark phrases in Ransom, such as this about Achilles, his soul not yet settled in him, or the notion of his killing Hector man to man but impersonally, seem to me to be gauzed and rather gritless, so different from Thoreau's sense of the epic poet. Homer was a greater hero than Achilles. At least one critic has acclaimed Ransom as a late masterpiece. Notwithstanding the undoubted pleasures of the prose, other readers may return with something like awe to the incomparable original, Homer's, with its godly vaults, its terrors, and the astonishing gore. So that's one measure for me of it's possible to admire a technique, admire a work, admire an ambition, and this is a very, very ambitious book. I mean, you take on Homer at your peril if you're a writer. But even so, to have... I was hearing too many... I was missing something as I read the book, and then I remembered those extraordinary scenes in the Homer. And for me, the stretch was too great, but for a lot of readers, it has obviously worked wonderfully.
And also, you could argue that that isn't really David Malouf's concern anyway. Does he pay a debt to Homer? Is he responsible for what Homer has created? And you can argue it either way, really.
Absolutely. He would have the view that artists and filmmakers and painters who have worked from other sources and narratives have had, that the artist has total freedom to impose his or her stamp on the work.
We're already, it's a short time to discuss such giant books and such huge themes, but I would like to touch a little bit on character. So I wondered if we could maybe jump to Priam and maybe discuss Priam a little bit. Can you talk us through the transformation that Priam experiences in the book?
Well, this is a very, very compelling, and I reread it last night, having looked at it closely 2 years ago. It's more and more compelling, I think, as a study of a broken god king of immense power and charisma, and that journey he makes, which is the only epic thing in it, the journey with Somax towards Achilles. But I think where the book really takes off, for me, apart from the beauty of the prose, is the scene with Achilles, which you must, look at that as closely as you can. The subtleties that are going on there for both men, because they are equals in that they are both these charismatic figures, and they have both lost loved ones. Priam has lost Hector and Achilles has lost Patroclus. But also what Priam deliberately reminds, it's a brilliant bit of, legal negotiation going on in that scene.
Which scene, Peter? Can you just give us an outline of it?
The scene in the camp when Priam
first meet?
When they eventually get there and they're sitting down and he's doing. Firstly, Priam is terrified and daunted by it because Achilles has the reputation of the slayer of men. He's the warrior, the hunter. Achilles,
and he's just
the
killed
hunter.
his son. He's reason to be in fear of his life, isn't he?
He's slaughtered his son and punished him and defiled the body in unimaginable ways. But Priam's trick of saying, you have a son whom Achilles hasn't seen for half the boy's lifetime because he's been too busy trying to retrieve Helen from the Trojans. He says, you've got a son. How would you like to see his body defiled in this way every day? And Achilles begins his resolve, because there are all the strong magical portents in this book that Achilles' days are numbered, as they are in fact. So I think those scenes between these two sort of heartbroken men and the tenderness almost at the end that arises between them, that's where Malouf can take, in not many pages, it's a brief section, can create something immensely moving and involving. And because he's stripping away the layers of the armour and the ego, I suppose, and the power, and getting back to vulnerable manhood, vulnerable fatherhood, and those kinds of qualities. So Priam has just gone on an extraordinary journey, not just in terms of mileage.
Right, and he's also gone through that incredible process of dismantling all the power and the royalty, the immunity that buys him.
Yeah.
The process of making himself vulnerable and being with Somax and delving into Somax's very domestic life and all these concerns that. Yeah. Excuse me, Priam has really never concerned himself with before. No. He goes through quite a transformation in that process.
Yes, and it's important to realise it is very much about people who are losing, about loss and mortality, and the sheer number of deaths in the Iliad is, of course, almost incalculable. And Somax himself has lost his 5 children. He's childless now, but it's Priam's preparedness to willingness to expose himself to the merely more human and mortal that is the magical trick that his family has feared he will do, because to his wife Hecuba, noble, aristocratic, she hates the thought of him being with a humble carter that they pick up in the market. So he's been humanised, hasn't he? He's come down from the tower, and he is now a functioning, frail human being of a kind we meet very often in Malouf.
Right, but throughout that process, interestingly, that's what actually elevates Priam into the level of the epic, isn't it? It's that journey of reducing himself back to his base human relationships and involvements that actually gives us the story, thus creating an epic character from him.
And also, in the original, of course, there are these extraordinary interventions, because this is a work of magic and myth, and he's protected along the way by, I forget who's protecting him, and then that great scene where he, done in about 2 or 3 lines, and you can't work out what's happening, but it's a real coup, because the cart and with Priam and Somax just suddenly is magic through the walls, the battlements, and all the men standing around. So you're still reminded in the Malouf that this is a work of mythic power.
It's
and
a
potential.
shame. Yeah, I'd like to ask you lots of questions about the magic and the fable element and things, but I can already see our microphone bearers advancing on us. So in just a second, we'll open up to questions from the floor. So if you want to have a think about what you'd like to ask Peter about the book. And normally in this kind of setting, we say that we would prefer not to have comments. But if you do want to make comments, if you can keep them short, I think it is really interesting to hear your responses to what you're studying and to what you've heard too. So if you'd like to make comments too, that's fine, as long as you keep them fairly brief. But before we open up to the floor, I wanted to just ask you one other thing, Peter, and that's about the portrayal of war in the novel, and how that relates to the very sanitised, in some ways, received images of war that we receive now today. It's a very different landscape, isn't it, from when the Greeks and the Trojans were out hand-to-hand combat. Our experiences today in 2011 of war is a very cleaned up version of government sanctioned images that we receive back from Iraq or Afghanistan. And yeah, what does this tell us about war, and what do you think David Malouf is saying about his portrayal of war?
It's not his primary aim. I think the power structures, certainly the sorrows and the debasement of leadership, I think, are high on his list. For a sheer, vivid, almost journalistic account of the monstrosity of which men are capable in battle, then you go to Homer, and also the violence in the hearts of the gods, who are sort of pulling all the strings in it. I think Malouf maybe even doesn't recoil, but I just don't think it's primarily what's motivating David in this particular book. And though war has been a persistent interest of his, how could it not? He was growing up in the middle of one world war, and he's written very movingly in Fly Away Peter about the Great War. Beautiful novella that, worth looking at. So it's an interest, but I still come back to the view that it's the psychological dealings between two isolated, conflicted men that is, I think that's his real theme. And
perhaps the effects of war and external forces on people and on grief
absolutely.
And all the human tragedy that's involved.
Which everyone in the Iliad and this book has been marked by the slaughter that has gone on in Troy for what they're up to about year 10, aren't they, of that amazing battle.
Because all the female characters in this novel, the only function that they serve in a lot of ways is to describe the effects of war. It's the sons that they've lost, or they wash the bodies, and their primary role in a way is to clean up.
Though isn't that a beautiful scene at the end where magnificent bit of writing where they've done the deal and Priam can take Hector back, and that scene where Achilles goes in, and then at some point the women say, now you leave us, this is our task, and they wash the still beautiful, still perfect, despite being dragged around in the dust for 11 days and nights, and they renew him, and it's a scene of great actuality, I think, really. I mean, David lived in Italy in a village for a long time while he was writing these books, and after he gave up academic life, and there has the feeling of suddenly of older, ancient customs, traditions, and rites as they prepare the body to be taken back.
Yeah. Great. Well, let's turn it over to you guys. Would somebody like to start us off? We've got about 10 minutes.
Okay. The idea of chance obviously plays a huge part in the play. I was just wondering, how significant do you think that theme is, and what are the main features that it entails in the play, if that makes sense?
Good question.
Yeah, it is a very good question. What's interesting for Malouf, of course, is that there is nothing left to chance because it's already been created, hasn't it? But he is a sufficiently bold author to take some liberties with the text, so that some of the events are given a new kind of twist, inflection, if you like. In the original, of course, a mythic work, the gods are absolutely determining the course of things. So you have this fabulous and to us inconceivable battle between the human will, which we think in the 21st century as invincible and confident and irresistible, and here these players are being all have this potentiality at any point for some cosmic intervention that will determine the course of events in their own lives, and often it's disastrous for them. So it's to how David, with that modern sensibility of the existentialist, of the human being as being in control of his destiny, and works with mythic characters who have been fated by the gods, is one of the, I think, risks in the book, and one of its very subtle qualities.
There's also that moment when it illustrates just how blasphemous it is for Priam to, for 1 second, doubt whether or not there might be other agency at work as well as the will of the gods. It's an interesting flash of modernity.
Yeah, and that's the course, isn't it? Priam is not just being sort of humanised in the way that I was trying to describe earlier, but he's also being modernised. He's being democratised. He's meeting man for the first time, really, meeting mortals, and so that's one journey he's on.
Wouldn't you say that Somax embodies the idea of common humanity? Do you think that's significant in the actual book?
Yeah, I think that's very, very astute. Somax is at a different level, and he's introduced to aid that process of humanising Priam. But he's also got clownish qualities. He's a device that we meet everywhere in literature. We learn he's a bit of a drinker. We're told he's a bit of a madcap. He's a clownish character. You know, he's still just hanging around the market every morning hoping someone will hire his 2 black mules. And then he's aware, he's a tender character, so he's aware that Priam is broken and heartbroken. And so the quiet way he humours him is endearing. And it does, I think, I was reminded of the clown in Shakespeare, the repeated clown, particularly in King Lear. I don't know if David was thinking of it, but he struck me as being the clown-like figure, slightly foolish, lovable, always trying to cheer up this broken god king character. And the accounts of his wife, the death of his children, do that absolutely well. And I found Somax one of the most engaging and kind of rounded, plausible characters in the book. Someone like Hecuba, for instance, doesn't seem to me to have much humanity. She's just a figure, an aristocrat who's not realised, whereas Somax, you kind of sense him, and because of the detail, the descriptions of the cart and the griddle cakes, the making of those interminable griddle cakes, you really get a strong sense of his presence, what he sounds like. You almost smell him, can't you? He's very real.
2 questions. Why does Malouf bring in the idea of chance, and what is the main motive to ransom? What is Priam's main motive to ransom his son's body? In the book, he's mentioned how he wants to be a legend and wants to be remembered, but is that his main motive?
What is Priam's relation to what, Hector's body?
Yeah. What is his main point to ransom his son's body?
Oh, right, the ransoming, the notion. Well, in the latter, here's again, in talk about chance, the the gods. He's had the mystic message from Isis, daughter of someone, I forget, not Zeus, the one of them, sent to convey he sees no way out of this predicament, and suddenly, so it is given to him the idea that only by supplicating himself, only by being deferential, only by taking a cart, because the cart's laden with gold, isn't it? Mm. There are all these offerings in it. Only by abasing himself to Achilles will he get the man back. Honour, but I think what both Homer and Malouf do is convey the sheer horror that that Priam feels at seeing his, because the violence done to the body. They cut the Achilles heel so that he can tie him up, strapped. There's been a figure in a lot of art. It's dragged behind the cart for day and night. That violence, so it's a kind of a rescue, and it gives the epic potential. Then getting the body back, of course, takes a lot longer in Homer than in Malouf. What was the first part? Something about
it was
chance.
About chance, and I think we covered it.
Touched on that
We're
already.
All right for chance, I think, from the lady at the front's question. So we might move on, just because we've only got a couple of minutes left. So we'll maybe take one at the back.
I was just wondering what you thought the significance of the physical body, especially Hector's body, is in relation to sort of the mind and what's going on with Priam.
I think the power of in the Homer, and David does this to some extent in the novel, is these are manly battles, these are manly qualities, and it's very significant. Hector is an ideal. Hector's probably the only admirable character in the Iliad. There's nothing admirable really about Achilles, who is impulsive, judgmental, jealous, capricious, all of that. Hector is a magnificent moral character, and to convey that, Homer, of course, gives him godlike beauty. And so it's very important in a work of art, if you're going to create a hero of that order, that the reader must, even not by elaborate over description, have a picture in their mind of great beauty and charisma. And I think Hector is invested with that, so that's what makes the anguish, the predicament of Priam and his family so powerful. Mm. And then, of course, the magical renewal of Hector's beauty every night after he's been dragged round in the dust, face down, isn't it? I think that's often said, which is the reader in the mind's eye, you see what that would do to a damaged person, especially in the 21st century. The magical renewal of his beauty, so great is the beauty, is one of the awesome liberties that you can't do that anymore, but Homer could do that, and they did it with just the sheer force of the mythic power and the godlike interventions.
And that's touched on in the beauty of the herald. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but the god that appears to, is it Hermes?
Yeah, Hermes.
Who appears to accompany them, give them safe passage. He's very beautiful and charming too, isn't it? So it reinforces that link between beauty and godliness.
Yes, and that's very powerful. The homoerotic in this book, the scene in Ransom where Patroclus is the young, older than Achilles, isn't he, who's murdered someone, and so he's brought to Achilles' house. And when Achilles is aware of this new introduction, who's a commoner, so it normally wouldn't have anything to do with him. And then there is a gaze between them. Mm-hmm. He dares to look. He knows that Patroclus is looking at him. And that exchange, and finally their eyes meet, and there is this kind of extraordinary connection, and we can read into that connection whatever we like, the ideal love, or more or less, and that that gives the book such energy, and I think that passage in David Malouf is very powerful. He doesn't. A different kind of writer nowadays could take that in very different directions, possibly sordid directions. Malouf merely conveys that, not infatuation, that recognition of the lover in very compelling ways, but in ways that only perhaps he would do.
Right.